Okay, afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here at the ITB. This is actually the first time I've been here, so very new to this whole environment. But for those of you that were maybe here on Wednesday of this week, in the opening week, you probably would have heard from a colleague of mine, Ali McCabe, who's essentially talked very passionately about how travel is a very important vertical for Facebook. It's a very important part of our business, I think is safe to say. But on the other hand, if you think about your own experience, travelers actually find Facebook equally as important. So one of the things that I do at Facebook is ultimately understand how our consumers behave. We obviously have data passed through back to us in a very passive way. So all the data that gets collected in terms of how people use Facebook is ultimately something that the team at Facebook has an ability to query and understand how travel patterns are actually changing over time. So that's one area of what I look after. The other area that I look after is essentially advertising effectiveness. So again, you've probably heard a few presentations over the course of this week around how Facebook is obviously a big social network, but how it's actually improving marketers and travel businesses as well. So I'm going to touch upon both those areas in my presentation. So just to start off with, I thought I'd introduce someone from a few years ago. So this guy here, I don't know if anyone knows him in the room, but he's an American psychologist or a social psychologist that ultimately looked at how connected the world was. And his name was Stanley Milgram. He conducted experiments around a project called the Small World Experiment. And the Small World Experiment actually led to this concept of 6 degrees of separation. I hope most people are familiar with this, have an understanding of what it means. But it essentially means that any two people in the world are actually connected by 6 steps of separation, or 6 degrees of separation. And what we have in this experiment, so what Stanley Milgram did in the 1960s when he conducted this experiment, was actually to ask people that were involved in the experiment to actually send a letter to their friends and ultimately reach this random person, this random stranger in Massachusetts in the USA. So effectively, his experiment was there to understand how many steps of letter writing it would take before it reached this random person and random stranger in Massachusetts. And what he found was the people that were successful at actually reaching this random person in the US actually took 6 stages of letter writing before they actually reached this person. So that was how he deduced, I suppose, how connected we were in the world. If you move on 40 years, 50 years, you ultimately get where Facebook comes in. Now, I think probably quite a few people may have seen this chart before, but this is essentially individual friend connections around the globe that Facebook has actually mapped out in a graphically visual way. So the data that we have here was roughly around 1 billion monthly active users that we have on the platform at the moment, and it shows the friend connection between individuals on the platform. And the interesting thing here that you see here is, I suppose, this doesn't actually show country borders. It doesn't actually show rivers or coastlines. It actually shows human friendships and human relationships in a very visual way. And if you imagine the amount of data that we have here and the understanding of how people are connected, we can run this experiment in a very different way to actually letter writing that Stanley Milgram did. So as I mentioned earlier, Stanley Milgram, when he did his experiment, he understood that there's actually 6 degrees of separation in the world. And we did some work, Mark obviously did some work, where we looked at using the computational power of Facebook and understanding of how friends are actually connected to basically recreate this experiment. And the finding that we had with, in collaboration with the University of Milan was to show that the number of connections between any 2 people in the world is actually reduced. And it's reduced down to 4 now. And even when you look at an individual country, when you actually drill down to a singular country, Germany, for example, US, for example, that number of 4 actually reduces to 3. So this is obviously, an understanding or a piece of research that we can do internally on our side, and I think it's quite a useful thing for the travel industry to really understand that Facebook, with its kind of understanding of connections of people, can actually do some very interesting things like that. So this is how we look at some of the data in terms of consumer insight at Facebook. One of the things that I'd like to talk about is really, we did a study last year with an independent research company where we looked at 3 different regions within Europe. So the UK audience, the Nordic region, and also the German audience as well, the German market. And what we did is we ran quantitative and qualitative analysis, roughly about 1,000 people in each market. And what we were trying to do was just really see how important travel was on Facebook, or how important Facebook was for travelers. And the one thing that we typically find is when people go away on holiday, they don't tend to bring newspaper media. They might bring some magazine media. They might bring books, that sort of thing. They don't tend to bring their TV stations or their radio stations from home. But Facebook very much stays with them the whole time. So if you think about that experience and you think about your own experience, when you travel, quite a lot, often people will check in at airports on exit of the country. And then when they land, one of the first things they do is actually open up their Facebook application as well. And if you can imagine what that actually proposes to us, what that gives us, it's a really strong and rich data source as to how people are traveling and also using Facebook. The stat that we have up here from the Near and Now research shows that 97% of people who go online when they're on holiday will actually log into Facebook. 91% will do it every couple of days. We had respondents tell us that I think it was 62% of people that we interviewed said they wouldn't know where their friends or family went on holiday unless they looked at Facebook. So, it's a very obvious experience. It's a very obvious consumer insight that we're finding, that Facebook is by far the biggest outlet for travel sharing experiences. And we can use it to our advantage. So if I show you this chart that we see here, now, again, this is data visualization based on all the information that we collect. But this is actually check-in behavior. So taking a look at data from 6 months in 2012, the first 6 months of 2012, we can actually map out the journeys and behavior that people are doing on Facebook. So again, as I mentioned, check in when you arrive at the airport, and check in again when you arrive at the destination, the attraction, the hotel, airline lounge. You see it happening the whole time. And one of the things that you can do with this sort of interesting data is actually plot it over time. You can see, what are up-and-coming routes, what are up-and-coming destinations for people. And having this level of data crowdsourced in a massive way is ultimately a very strong and interesting data set that we could all use. So you can't have a Facebook presentation about user behavior and the marketing industry without actually talking about fans. Quite often, I think in the early stages when, certainly my team were doing a lot of work on this, is really trying to identify the value of a fan. What does it mean to my business when I have 200,000 fans, 500,000 fans, 1 million fans? Do you as marketers, and I'm assuming a lot of people are marketing related here, are you rewarded for reaching fan milestones? Is that a goal that you set yourself internally in your industry? And one of the things I tend to do and help our clients understand is that it's not just about the fans. I think if you were in Lee McCabe's earlier keynotes on Wednesday, you would have heard that his explanation that Facebook is a marketing channel. It's, as well as a social platform, it's really there for advertisers and businesses to market their products. So we really think that this fan phenomenon, or this kind of click and engagement phenomenon, is something that we really shouldn't be measuring as marketers. And I'll try and explain why we're doing that. So what are the things that you really should be measuring? Now, I think a lot of people will say that Facebook is a complicated beast. It's actually a massively changing platform the whole time. What should we really be focusing on when it comes to measurement? And it's these 4 things that I'd like to just suggest and kind of stress in terms of how you should be measuring Facebook. The first one is really reach. So as a platform, are you actually communicating to more people that you can when you compare it to other media channels? So if you're using Facebook as a platform for either sort of customer management, CRM type stuff, in order to build your brand, in order to reach more customers, to increase performance, then reach is ultimately a very strong goal that you should be thinking about. Equity of your brand is, again, something that you should be measuring. So does the platform actually improve familiarity, awareness of your brand? These are the things that you measure when you compare your print media or your television media. So this should be the same way that you measure Facebook as well. Conversion performance, again, if you're not using conversion pixels on your sites to track back in terms of what media channels, whether Facebook is actually contributing towards online conversion, then this, again, is something you should be doing. And ultimately, ROI. So whenever anyone does marketing exercises, ROI is a big determinant of whether something's successful or not. So these are the 4 things that we think are very important. Now, one of the things, obviously, is travel advertisers, destination marketers, hotel groups. These are the things that I think you should be thinking about. These are the things that you should be comparing Facebook against, those 4 measures against your other marketing channels. And one of the things that we've done, especially for ITB this year, is we've launched actually 4 new case studies that we've done with our clients. And again, case studies are there to prove effectiveness. So the example here for Son & Clare TV essentially shows how they had a challenge in terms of generating specific awareness amongst certain audience groups. Brand favorability was something that was needed to be improved. Now, this is something that we can very easily do on Facebook. We talked about the user-generated behavior. In this example, what we do is we work with a third party. So again, measuring your Facebook marketing performance can be done using third-party research vendors, for this example, with Nielsen as a supplier. So in this example, we're measuring reach, but also brand equity. And just to give you a very straightforward, very quick methodology on how we do this, quite often we're asked about, okay, so you're telling us that you've actually improved my brand awareness by 5% as a result of this campaign. How did you do that? Well, as I mentioned, we use third parties like Nielsen, and we run polling experiments. So again, if you think about the reach of Facebook in Germany, for example, where we have 26 to 29 million people using the platform every month, quite simply, we can ask them questions. And we do this through a very lightweight polling exercise, where people will actually just respond very quickly. And because we know through impression data who's been exposed to a campaign and who hasn't, we have a very neat way of controlling whether someone has actually changed their behavior or their impression or perception of a brand, if they've been exposed to the advertising or not, basically through this type of behavior. Another very quick example of this is really for Lufthansa. So Lufthansa came to us where they were really keen on, again, impressing on a certain target audience where they had some challenges. So we worked with them and actually asked Nielsen to do some analysis on this. So again, understanding who was exposed to the media, who wasn't exposed to the media, and then asking our respondents, our people on Facebook, a question about whether the favorability of the brand was improved as a result of advertising. So when you think about proving the effectiveness of marketing on Facebook to your internal stakeholders, to your external stakeholders, these third-party resources are a good way of doing that. And then the last one I just wanted to show was really very quickly was Thomas Cook Germany, where we looked at conversion performance. So ROI conversion is, again, a very key thing for a lot of online pure-play advertisers or online and offline advertisers. And one of the things that we found there through using Facebook conversion pixels, where people can actually apply that to conversion and checkout pages on their own websites, is to understand if cost per orders are actually influenced or reduced. And this is what we found with this example for Thomas Cook, where 38% lower in terms of cost per order by using Facebook compared to other display campaigns. And these are things that you can do yourselves already, so it's something that's very possible given the situation that you're in now. So just really to round up, I wanted to, my main initiative was really to talk about how you should be thinking about measuring Facebook in terms of its ROI. I've given you some examples, and here are some third parties that we basically have said we've approved their methodology, we understand the way that they do it, and actually introductions to these sorts of companies can help you measure the return on investment on Facebook as well. So just really to really wrap up, the next steps really for you, I mean, I'm just kind of suggesting this should be the way that you approach things. Well, fans and click-through rate and engagement data, although it's a good thing to measure, and in some ways it's easy to measure, we don't really think it's a good way to actually assess the marketing performance on Facebook. So reevaluate, I think, what you do there. Performance, so again, use the Facebook conversion pixel. Use that as a method of attributing value back to your Facebook media campaigns. Consider brand building. And consider third-party research companies to help you measure the effectiveness of the branding on your platform as well. And then the last thing that we see with a lot of, I suppose, startup companies and digital companies is to really test and learn. So test, learn, iterate, test, learn, iterate. Continue that process. Understand that the platform is continually changing, but there's lots of processes that you can actually do that. Now, if you find these things kind of particularly difficult or particularly challenging, I just go back to the original slide and say to yourselves, if you can't do it or you don't have the resources inside, just remember that you're only 4 steps away from someone that probably can. So, thank you.